I'm Becky Dayton, and I think you all know who I am. I own the Vermont Bookshop, and I think you all know who Cindy Ellen Hill is. But Cindy is a Vermont environmental attorney who graduated from Vermont Law School. And I'm not going to look at my phone because I know how much we hate people. No. And she has made a career of helping out municipalities and nonprofits, and she is a great member of our community. And to treat herself in 2018, 2021, Cindy went back to college and completed an MFA in writing and poetry and literature. And I think it's pretty amazing that you have a dual career as poet and lawyer. Every small town needs a poet lawyer. So this is, I'll just add that this is part of our Vermont Authors series, which has been monthly up until this point, at which we are going to take a couple of months off for the dark months. But I am delighted that Cindy agreed to do this with us, and I can't wait to hear you read your poetry and talk about Italy.
Thank you, and I deeply appreciate being here, and I deeply appreciate our local independent bookstores, which has been a delightful part of the journey of this book. This is my third poetry book, but with the first two, I will confess that marketing was all like a complete mystery to me, and on this one, we made a concerted effort to start reaching out to all of Vermont's and now New England's independent bookstores and trying to work with them, trying to both get the book on the shelf, but then I've been doing things like taking out advertising in local papers, directing people to the local bookstore to buy the book. And it's all a little bit of an experiment, but I'm very excited about that synergy because I'm deeply fond of local bookshops. So thank you for being there and for having things like this. So. Yes, I went back. It was my 60th birthday present to myself. I went back for my MFA in poetry. And somewhere along the way, starting before the MFA, but then certainly deepened through it, I developed a really deep and abiding love of Italian literature and Italian poetry. Really born of my utterly ridiculous and groundless obsession with the sonnet. So those of you who are in the poetry group know that that's about 98% of what I write is sonnets. And usually when I say sonnet, the first word out of somebody else's mouth is Shakespeare, but Shakespeare started writing like about 350 years after the sonnet was invented in Sicily. And there was a rich, robust, and varied history of the sonnet long before Shakespeare, in my opinion, destroyed it. Before Shakespeare ruined the sonnet. And not only that, but when you see a history of sonnets, people are like, oh, it was invented in Italy, and then Shakespeare in the English sonnet. Well, you know what? You walk into any bookstore in Italy today, and right behind the counter is their wall of poems, of contemporary poetry, and you flip open any of those books, and there are sonnets, and there's Tozerima, and there are sestinas, and there's free verse as well. But there are, so that people in Italy have been writing Italian sonnets consistently since about 1200. And it hasn't changed. So in fact, much like haiku is a huge thing in American English poetry now, and I have no basis whatsoever for determining whether it has any resemblance whatsoever to actual like Japanese haiku. Sonnets are kind of a thing in English and American poetry, but they are only sort of distant cousins of the Italian sonnet, which has continued in Italy and also in France. And so my daughter lived in Italy for 12 years until literally yesterday. She's now moved to the Netherlands since her husband's job moved, but we got to spend a lot of time in Italy over the last 12 years, and I got to shop at the antiquarian bookstores in Torino and start to attempt to learn to read Italian. And actually now that I am done my MFA, I'm now a Middlebury College student. I am auditing Italian 101, which at Middlebury is an intensive class. Like all their classes are double. The language classes meet every day. And they do 4 years of language in 2 years. That's kind of the big thing. And my goal is to finish up their 2 years of Italian study there, if they'll continue to have me, and apply to their master's in Italian literature. For a reason, and I'll get to reading some poetry in just a minute, but among the other things that I've been researching are these very early Italian sonnets, and I brought a couple of books here that have things like, you know, the first century of Italian sonnets, you know, 1220 to 1321. And one of the amazing things, again, when you think about sonnets, you think about Shakespeare, and you think about these love poems, you know, these very flowery love poems. Well, amongst these early sonnets, there were flowery love poems. There were also poems about war and philosophy and about science and about hating your parents because they won't give you your inheritance now, so you're forced to not be able to drink, you know, the way your friends are. Intently political debates in sonnets. And there's all these communal sonnets right from the get-go. Giacomo di Montini, after writing the first sonnet, I think the second or third sonnet was what's called a tenzone, which is where you'd write a sonnet addressed to another poet as a form of argument and or inquiry, often talking about a third poet. So like I'd write a sonnet addressed to David saying, David, Dick Heiler's been writing these, like, you know, rhyming things about God, and what do you think about them? You know, isn't it true that he's just defying, you know, the Bible, and shouldn't we shun his poetry? Like, I'd write something provocative, or in sonnet rhyme form, and you would need to answer it using the same rhymes, or preferably even the same last words in the line that I had in my original argument. Often sending it on, so instead of answering me, you would send it on to Dick and say, hey, Cindy's asking me, you know, in the sonnet about this, and I think that you ought to tell her, or whatever. And there'd be these long chains of sonnet conversations that were then, of course, read aloud at various, you know, gatherings and things. So the sonnet was, it was poetical dialogue. It was part of this whole troubadour tradition and public performance tradition, and it was these little messages that you sent back and forth. The earliest sonnets were written in the Sicilian dialect, and then all of the very original scripts in some politics and war that happened afterwards got destroyed, and the closest that we have to them are copies in the Tuscan dialect that are now in archives in the Vatican. There are very few of those that have been translated into English, and then some of them are fascinating. There's one particular folio, and the only English translations that I have ever found are in this book, The Very Rich and Varied World of the Italian Sonnet by Rinaldina Russell, which is basically, it's almost like a doctoral thesis. It's an academic tome. And among them are several groups of sonnets between gay lovers in Perugia in the 1300s and in the 1500s. And most of them were lawyers and notaries, and they were writing very publicly about their relationships. And only a couple of them have been translated. And I've written a few essays that have gotten published on this, comparing the language that's used in those to some modern sonnet writers and to modern writers writing about their same-gender relationships. And I am just dying to get into the Vatican archives and see the other ones in between that were not yet translated. The only way to get into the Vatican archives is to be in a qualified research program. You have to be either in a research master's or in a doctoral program. And I tried when I was in my MFA to get in, and they wouldn't get me in. Thus my drive at the moment to learn Italian, get into the literature masters, and be able to access the Vatican archives, because to me these early works are so important, and they so speak to present conversations about identity, personal identity, sexual identity, and also politics, like all of these issues, and the fact that people, Italian songwriters, were writing about all this in hundreds and hundreds of years ago, is something you wouldn't think of, especially if you think of sort of sonnets as these courtly love, vehicles. So, in any event, long story short, that's where I'm going with all this Italian class stuff, and I also just love the fact that we grew up with a Western canon of English language literature, but there's billions of books out there and billions of seminal works and masterpieces, in other languages, and until you start to learn, most of them haven't been translated into English, so unless you learn the Italian, the Arabic, and Hebrew, and that they're all in, you can't access this. So it's been so tantalizing to begin to access some of those works. So this book, Mosaic Poems from Travels in Italy, arose, there are a lot of sonnets in it. There's some other things too. There's sestinas, which were early troubadour forms. There is a little bit of free verse. There's one haiku. But a lot of them do harken back to these earlier Italian forms. And I'll start with one here. So this is actually what's called a Petrarchan sonnet. This is the opening one in the book, and this is I was trying to get to that sensation. You've all probably flown to Europe, and usually you're on the red eye. So just as you're getting there and your brain is, mush from the flight, you see the sun breaking, that orange glow from the airplane with the sun coming up over the horizon, and you feel like you should, and then you get dumped out into this fluorescent light airport, and it's just such a fascinating sensation. So this is Red Eye to Fiumicino. Fluttering in our superficial dreams, suspended in the amniotic night, insulated from any sense of flight by soft red wine and small flickering screens, viewed mindlessly through heavy half-closed eyes, enveloped in the darkened white noise roar. So many tiny lives without a door, disconcerted by shuddering black skies. They crack on the horizon, dull orange, threatening release in dawn's brutal sight. To drop us from our womb into water, but we settle soft beside the Tiber and find ourselves summarily disgorged, blinking against the cold fluorescent light. So throughout this book, I was looking at different areas of Italy, starting with quite a bit of time in Rome. But you know what? I've been privileged to spend enough time there, like a block of a month, a block of 3 months, a block of another month at a time, and with my daughter living there, to be able to be, certainly I'm not a person who's lived in, Italy for an extended period of time, but I also somewhat eschew the, big tourist crush. I want to meet people who live there. I want to find out where's the diner that local working people go to lunch, where's, the kind of more casual stuff. That's what I'm far more interested in, is finding out what is it actually like to live there. So there's a lot of that in here. There's a lot of different characters, and a sense of wrestling with immigration issues, wrestling with national identity issues and politics, wrestling with climate change and this massive heat. I was just saying, you were in Rome last year, and it was wicked hot. Was that? And it was in the fall?
Yeah, we were there in the middle of September. It was over 90 every day.
And in July and August, it's been running over 100. Sicily was running out of water, So there's the big touristy things, but then there's also a lot. They're wrestling with a lot of things going So this, here is another poem about Rome. This is actually one of the earlier Dalantini forms of sonnet. In the beginning, the first sonnets, the rhymes alternated lines, so it was an A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. That A, B, B, A, B, B, A pattern that we now think of as the Italian sonnet did not come till much later. That is more a Petrarchan sonnet, and so that's a good 150 years, like after the sonnet was invented. That first 100 years, it's mostly this alternating form or even monorhymes, which is more like an Arabic rhyming scheme. Anyway, this is probably all far too much information. As I said, I am such an obsessed nerd about these Italian sonnets. So this one is in that alternating sound form. It's called Rome in January. These are the branches of an orange tree in winter. These are the things we left behind. These are the leaf-bare twigs. Get thee behind me, demon time. Seeking Sophia, I find Lilith walking in darkness with brass keys beneath clouded silhouettes of stone pine. She picked them up when Peter was asleep, her breath smelling of wet stone and red wine. These are the travertine steps, the hard edge of cast iron plates buried in black sidewalks, of old mosaics buried in stone blocks, a river caught below a low-arched bridge. These are defiant strokes of paint absorbed by porous stone, leaving bright golden orbs. And those strokes of paint, the one thing you probably noticed about Rome too is there is graffiti everywhere. But the fun thing about that is, I don't know if you watched like the HBO series of Ancient Rome. Graffiti has been a cultural element of Roman culture since like the very beginning of Rome, which is so fascinating. You know, it's so shocking to our eyes. Even if you've been in New York and seen graffiti, you go to Rome and it's like you say, you know, these monumental, gorgeous stone classical governmental buildings with brilliant colored spray paint all over them, and you're like, I can't believe they let them do that. But it's a thing. It's actually kind of a cultural thing. So that was a Dalantini form of sonnet. The other thing about these early sonnets is they were really blended and melded with a lot of these other troubadour forms, the strombato, the canzone, the canzonetti, all these other different forms of poetry, and there were massive different forms of sonnets in the early days, many of which really have not made it into English. One of them is something called a sonetto rinterzato, and it has, and one thing I should say is that actually Italian poetry is syllabic rather than metrical. English poetry goes by feet. Usually, you know, again, the sonnet, we think of iambic pentameter, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? The Italian language isn't, the pronunciation is different, and the poetry doesn't count it doesn't count feet, it counts syllables. It's syllabic. Most of it is hendecasyllabic, 11 syllables per line. When I started picking apart Dalantini's and then later Petrarch's sonnets, I found that often the first two lines were 13 syllables and then all the rest were 11. Sometimes the volta and the change was 13 or 14 syllables. Again, far too much information, I know. But so one of these forms, as I said, is the sonetto rinterzato, or like an interrupted sonnet, and it has a mess of lines. How many is it? There's these full lines that are 14 syllables, and they're interrupted by rhyming half lines of 7 syllables. And I tried my hand at one, and so here's what I'm going to read you, and it's called Jenny Hickey's Screen Porch, and it's from as of yet non-published manuscript called Inhabited Space. I don't, my syllable count is exact, but I'm not convinced that I like this form or what it was doing. And I suspect in Italian it sounded better. Anyway, but for what it's worth, you've never heard a sonato or intenzato in your life before, so here you go. You can't say that again. Jenny Hickey's Screen Porch, Scoville, New Jersey, summer 1978. The Ouija board melts letters out across the low rattan table where our outstretched hands drift with the planchette like figure skaters in a slow spin. Glider springs croak rhythmic time below limp floral cushions. Beetles, longing to get in, bang into unseen barriers, then fall to the white sand. Mosquitoes hum, an incessant rain of phrases written beyond the veil, from hidden condensation in heavy air to fingers held within transparent walls. You believe in this communication, in eternal affection. Pondering vague messages, I find ice in the kitchen and bring us cold mint tea, silver sugar bowl, a long spoon. You've closed your eyes, lost in a dream. Twilight jazz bands in Harlem. You were just 18 under sparkling dance floor lights when he swept you off your feet. Now he's gone home and left you in this place of in-between, yearning trapped behind a screen. Your wrinkled face an image of repose in love, serene. At your feet, the scraps of paper among jumbled words strewn in thin pencil lines. You have traced his whisper, see you soon. So, yeah, I had to do it because I had to try this form. And I love the image of the poem. My great-grandmother, who was obsessed with the Ouija board, trying to talk to my great-grandfather through the Ouija board on the screen porch. But I'm not convinced the form is an entirely enduring one. In any event, okay. So, let's see. So a lot of these, as I said, had, they were syllabic. They had 11 or 13 or 14 syllables. And I have also trying to experiment with this. I've written a sonnet. It's not quite rhyming, but it's somewhat reminiscent of rhyme, but it is syllabic and with 13 syllables a line. Again, it's a bit of an experiment. And this is called On First Looking into the Keats House, Rome. Now, you may or may not know, have you heard of the Spanish Steps? Were you at the Spanish Steps?
Mm-hmm.
You must have been. The Spanish Steps in Rome, where it's famous, everybody gets engaged on them, it's just famous tourist site. That place actually used to be called the English Ghetto. And it was called the English Ghetto because all the young English people with tuberculosis went there, and that's where all the cheap apartments were that they went to. And that is where Keats died, right there on the Spanish Steps. And right next to the Spanish Steps is the Keats Shelley House. It's now a museum. It is actually an apartment about the size of this room, which is where Keats died. But did you go into the Keats house?
I didn't go into the Keats house. I went to the cemetery where he is.
Where he's buried, yeah. So, it's a little apartment on the Spanish Steps. Keats was trying to get to southern Italy, didn't have the money, wound up in Rome in November, and he was there, but he died in January or February. So landing in Rome in November in the rain is probably not the best cure for tuberculosis. And they had no money, couldn't find a place, so there's this woman, Anna Angeletti. Her husband was a painter. He was out traveling around Europe, occasionally sending back a few dollars painting. And she was taking in laundry, lived there with a couple of teenage daughters, and were desperate for money. And they took a curtain and hung it across the room. And Keats was literally on the other side of the curtain, like dying of tuberculosis, while she was doing her wash, taking in laundry with the girls on the other side of the curtain. And then, interestingly enough, Keats's friend Severn somehow got a piano into the apartment and would play to him to soothe him. It's now a museum that's basically like a library. It's this huge collection of works of Shelley and of Keats, and also of Mary Shelley, and to my shock and amazement, if you've seen the movies about Mary Shelley, like she meets Percy Bysshe Shelley when she's walking down the street with her little writing desk, and her actual little writing desk is there, as are some the earliest manuscripts of Frankenstein are all there, so it's actually pretty amazing. In any event, so I wrote this in 13-syllable lines, trying to pay homage to this old style. Well, I'm first looking onto the Keats house, Rome, English ghetto, Spanish steps, and Keats gasping for breath. Anna Angeletti, widow of Alessandro, an artist of some note, mother of 2 young women, divided her apartment with a linen curtain, cooked and ironed, listening to Keats cough up his lungs, drowned out from time to time by Severn playing Haydn. Under glass sits Mary Shelley's wooden writing desk where modern Prometheus killed romanticism. Obsession with man and mythological nature turned its page to peer at monsters of his own making. Naive fantasy of Endymion fell asleep, dreaming of a dystopia where Keats is still dead. The piano must have come in through the window. And so while we're still in Rome, let's see if I can find this. One of the things that I will not read the whole thing, because it's just too much. One of the things I wrote here is a sonic crown, which is a string of 7 interlocking sonnets. As soon as you had sonnets, you also had these sonnet series, and in fact, I'm presently trying to find a publisher for my the creative thesis for my master's was a novel in sonnet verse, so that is a sonnet series of about 600 sonnets that hasn't found a publisher yet, shockingly, but I'm working on it. A sonic crown is a series of 7 sonnets where the last line of each one becomes, or it's a modification, the first line of the next one, and then the very last line goes back to the beginning. This was actually where I fell in love with sonnets, ironically, because I am not of the deeply religious Christian persuasion, but reading John Donne's Holy Sonnets, and there is a crown called La Corona, and it's actually a series of sonnets about the life of Christ. But when I read it and was like, and saw how these sonnets interlocked and did this whole story, I was absolutely entranced. That was many years ago, and that's what set me on my sonnet journey. So I'll just read one of those 7, and it's called Drinks in Trastevere. And it mentions Giacomo Belli. So Giacomo Belli, writing in the early 1800s, was famous for his sonnets in the Romanesco dialect, the local vernacular of Rome, which is still spoken. There's a lot of local dialects. And he not only was in the vernacular, but he wrote in the voices of street people. So he wrote sonnets in the voice of, the butcher and the rag vendor and, whatever, stray dogs. And really, some of them really bawdy, some really rough. It was completely the opposite of the English romanticism that was going on at the same time. And if any of you have a love of poetry, my favorite book on the planet that I so highly recommend you read is this book called Abba Abba. It's by Anthony Burgess, who wrote Clockwork Orange, right? Anthony Burgess was a brilliant writer. This book, it has 2 parts, and the first part is a little novelette or novella in which Giacomo Belli was actually writing in Rome at the same time that Keats was there when he was dying. And Anthony Burgess imagines that the 2 of them meet and have a dialogue about sonnets and about formal poetry and what kind of a voice it should be. And it's all about the aesthetic of poetry and the aesthetic of art. And who are you serving? Are you there to be a voice of the people? Are you there to bring some sort of, higher elite beauty? Just all of these things we talk about art. And it imagines them writing these messages back and forth and having this kind of conversation through other writers. No evidence whatsoever that they did, but they were both there at the same time. And for the first month or 2 that Keats was there, he was getting up and getting out to, pubs and dining halls and stuff, really close to where Giacomo Belli was. And the title, if you've been to, if anyone's been to Anthony Burgess's grave in Monaco, I haven't, unfortunately. Abba Abba is his epitaph. That's all it says on the stone, and then it has his dates. And in the very end of this is something like somewhat wildly, it's either really hokey or really profound, depending on your perspective, but he imagines that Keats, literally on his deathbed, suddenly has this epiphany that Abba Abba, the ABBA rhyme scheme of the sonnet, which also means father, father, that the rhyme and metrical scheme of sonnets and other formal poetry, but particularly sonnets, is itself a language that is like a universal language, or like a song rhythm, like a rhythm that runs through and beats through us, and that this is why it has resonated for so many hundreds of years, and it's not so much the words of the sonnet as the fact of sonnet itself and its structure that is the important aesthetic. And I read that and I was like, wow. Anyway, and then the second part is the only translations into English of any of Giacomo Belli's sonnets, and they are all blasphemous sonnets. They are really blasphemous. And some of them are kind of funny, and others are like, whoa, that's going to offend people. So these are the offensive sonnets of Giacomo Belli. And because they're in the Romanesco dialect, they are so hard to translate, and Anthony Burgess did these translations, and he's the only person who has done that. So if you want to, anyway, I love this book. And in the Keats house in Rome, they have it in Italian but not in English. It's actually out of print in English, but you can find it at thrift books, and you can probably order it through your friendly life. Anyway, so he's mentioned here in Trastevere, there's a huge statue of him with his top hat, and that's like the welcome into Trastevere, and most tourists don't know who he is, but that gathering spot is now the big party spot, and there's always like people hanging around drinking. So anyway, drinks in Trastevere. The rainwater has found its own way out for 1,000 years, but now the houses of stone carvers, bread bakers, and blacksmiths hold bars and cafes. Exchange students flout the drinking age back home, take selfies, pout like supermodels, order rhubarb spritz, while Giacomo Belli maintains his wits even as bottles crash and cheap takeout food trucks swarm like bees around his stone knee. He spoke their language, after all, the rogue, the dispossessed, the rough and tumble thugs. A cab driver turns his mouth down and shrugs. Andiamo I turisti, odiamo I turisti, noi siamo distrutti. So do you know, or can you guess what those last lines?
Let's go to andiamo.
So andiamo I turisti, odiamo I turisti. That sort of would say the same thing here.
The tourists are coming
No.
yeah.
It's basically, we love the tourists, we hate the tourists.
So
it's like, so andiamo I turisti, odiamo I turisti. So odious, odiamo I turisti. Noi siamo distrutti, we are destroyed. And this is actually literally what a cab driver said to me. So one way I love to practice Italian is I always just talk to the cab drivers. I get in the front seat and I talk to them. They're a captive audience, they have to talk to them, right? And I came up with a list of questions to start asking them. The first one is always, in Rome, I always ask them if they prefer Roma or Juventus, which is like asking someone if they're like a Yankees or a Red Sox fan in like Brooklyn, right? And you get a big spiel from that. And I asked that this cab driver grew up in Trastevere, but now you can't afford the house. It's all these, now it's all fern bars, and that was what he said. He said, we love tourists, we hate tourists, we're destroyed. We're destroyed. Anyway, so, all right.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Can I interrupt?
absolutely.
When you were traveling in Italy, were you taking notes about places, or
Oh, yeah.
that you wanted to convert to poetry?
So, lots of times when I was traveling, so this book came about, I did my last residency at VCFA, or the winter one in Rome, and actually while we were there, we had to keep scrapbooks and notebooks, and I've actually got my scrapbook back there on the table with the biscotti, and it's got a lot of the original poems. That's where I was writing stuff down, as well as like paintings and notes and receipts and all that good stuff. When I got home from that trip, I realized that from when we spent a month there for my daughter's graduation, and we'd spent over 3 months there last year or 2 years ago when my granddaughter was born. Every time I'd gone on trips, I'd done a lot of writing, and so they were scattered around in my poems, so I had dumped them all in one folder and said, it was very interesting how this came out. So I said, maybe someday I'd do something with that. And then on one of the VCFA alumni Facebook pages, somebody asked, so what did everybody do this week? And I said, well, I put all of my poems from years of travels in Italy into a folder, but nobody publishes travel poetry this day. And one of the alumni came back and said, actually, I have a publishing house and that's what I do, send me your manuscript. And that was Sarah Leamy from Wild Dog Press, and that's what she is. She's a travel writer, and she started this travel micro press, and I sent it to her, and she absolutely loved it. So she hadn't published poetry before. She mainly published essays and other kind of travel books, and so she published this. But yes, as I travel around, I always journal when I'm traveling, and I'm usually writing poetry and notes or lines, and especially then I have a whole half a notebook of these conversations with cab drivers because they were just all so precious. So that was one of my favorite lines from a cab driver. The other one was, we were driving by the Ministry of Health, right across the bridge in Trastevere, which is one of the fascist architecture buildings in Rome. And I knew it was, so I asked him in Italian, questo edificio è architetturo fascista. And he looked at me, he's like, and he goes, well, long ago, molti anni fa, there were, era fascisti in Italia. Today, no more. There's no fascist in Italy. And then he said, and then there's like silence. He says, except the government. And I laughed so hard, and he started laughing, and it was so funny because he was trying to he's trying to be like Mr. oh, I have to put a good face on your own for the tourists, and he's like, well, except the government. It's like, that's hysterical. That is so funny. Let me just check something. So, as I said, I've been learning Italian. So, how many of you are doing Duolingo?
I did it for French.
Did you do it for French? So, for years I was doing Duolingo in Italian. And so, even though I know tiny bits of Italian, French, and Spanish, I actually read it a lot better than I speak it. Speaking is just a whole different level. But of course, as soon as I'm starting to learn another language, I start writing poetry in it. I start writing things in it. And it's funny because I recently found a book of piano songs I wrote when I was 5, a week after I started learning piano. So it's sort of like as soon as I start learning something, part of the way that I process it or continue to learn it is trying to write things. And so the very first poem I wrote in Italian is called Sonetto di Duolingo, with translations. It started out as all these lines from Duolingo, right? They always have these totally absurd things, but then somehow it wound up a little bit more cohesive. La donna legge il menu al ristorante. Il pinguino mangia la frutta alla zoo. L'acqua di vita è dolce, beviamo. La scimmia non è un elefante. Le indossa un vestito affascinante. Lo squalo è un toro ammacato. Gli uomini adorano la carne, tagliamo. Le farfalle volano di notte, brividante. I bambini, richiedente asilo, dominante, corrono per strada incustoditi. Le loro piccole pance sono piene di fame, la donna e gli uomini non sono simpatizzanti, i cani prendono le ossa, si lamentano tutti, nella morte si ama tutti bestiali. Which means, the woman reads the menu in the restaurant. The penguin eats fruit in the zoo. The water of life is sweet, we drink. The monkey is not an elephant. She wears a sparkling dress. The shark is a bull at the market. The men adore meat, we slice. Butterflies fly in the night, flickering light. The children seeking asylum, the Dublinante, run in the street unattended. Their little bellies are full of hunger. The women and the men are not sympathizers. The dog gets the bones. They all complain. In death, we are all beasts. Do you know the term the Dublinante? We don't hear it much here, but basically it's the, there was a treaty signed in, or agreement, global agreement signed in Dublin regarding protection of undocumented immigrants, basically refugees, like the people that come across the Mediterranean in boats, and they're allowed to remain under this Dublin, so they're called the Dublinante, the people who are there by virtue of the Dublin Accord. I guess it is an international accord. And then here's another one with Italian, and then what I've been kind of doing is, I like, some of these in here, there's the poem and then the translation, but I've also been playing with this writing, like intermixed lines and stanzas in English and Italian, just really for playing with the sound of it. So here's one called October Rain, Pioggia di Ottobre. I cannot see the falling rain, it's falling in mist and silver strange. Non riesco a vedere la pioggia che cade, sta cadendo nella nebbia e in argento strano. I cannot see the falling rain, it's falling among autumn leaves and bitter change. Non riesco a vedere la pioggia che cade, sta cadendo tra le foglie autunnali e cambiamento. I cannot see the falling days falling softly in a mound, but softly I lay down, and damp chill wraps my soul, and winter falls around me, and it stays. Non riesco a vedere I giorni che cadendo dolcemente in autunno, ma dolcemente mi straio, e l'umidità gelida avvolge la mia anima, e l'inverno cade intorno a me li rimani. So it's been fun to play with, to play with the language and not as a translation, but more as kind of a...
Were those lines translations of the English?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They were just interspersed instead of translations.
I'm curious,
Yep.
which came first, your love of poetry or your interest in these specific forms?
Oh, I've been writing poetry like forever.
Because I write poems and there's no form.
Yeah.
I don't do it very often, but, so I was just curious which came first for you.
Yeah, so I've written poetry since I was wee. And I've almost always written in form. I've mostly written in form, and part of it is I also compose music. And I feel when I write free verse, it's like, I look at free verse and I'm like, how do you know it's done? Like, when you stop, you just keep writing for 100 pages, so there's no end in sight. Then again, here I am having written hundreds and hundreds of pages of sonnets, so who am I to blame? I like the form, and maybe that does come from music as well, because I like the sound and the rhythm, and even when I'm writing free verse, it winds up being rhythmical or sort of pulsing, and I read it over aloud and loud and keep tweaking the words so that it comes out with a certain pattern. So you get the substance, and then you get or the narrative aspect of it, but then you get the lyrical aspect, which is how does it, in music we say, how does it scan? When you're trying to match your lyrics to the lines of music, how does it scan? How does it fit in terms of a rhythm and a pattern? And I think that has always driven me. But I didn't fall in love with the sonnet until far more recently, and I didn't start writing them incessantly until COVID. And part of it was that I expected my work to vanish during COVID, and I was like, good, I can finally pull those novels out of my drawer and work on those. And then my work exploded during COVID. Apparently everyone who had all these legal things they never got to suddenly decided, like, oh, we'll do that now. Like, I'm sitting around home with nothing to do, I guess I'll sue somebody. My work exploded. I was busier than ever, oddly enough, and I was so frustrated because I had wanted to get to my novels, and I was like, that's it, I'm going to write a poem every day. And I was like, that's it, I'll write a sonnet. I can do 14 lines, I'm going to write 14 lines every day. I didn't want to do a haiku, I thought that was too short, that would be like, great. So I said, that's it, I'm going to write a sonnet every day, and I started writing a sonnet every day, and then I started reading everything on the planet I could get my hands on about sonnets. And then, of course, this 14 lines a day turned into these big sonnet series and compulsive things.
So fun.
And it got this. So I know we're coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to really briefly mention the other major form you can hear in Italian poetry, which is terza rima. And most scholars say this was actually invented by Dante. It is the form in which he wrote the Commedia. It's still extremely popular in Italian poetry. So this is a book by Amalia Guglielminetti, who was a famous Italian poet. He died in 1941. And this whole book is these 13-line terza rima poems by her, and she was just amazing. This is also, again, I said you walk into any Italian bookshop and you say, where's the contemporary poetry? And it's a wall right at the books, and you say, who do you recommend? And they just light up, and they're like, oh, you gotta read this person and that person. It's just amazing. And most of the books look like this. They're put out by, they're very simple. A lot of them are just a white cover with the name. There's a press called Mandale in Milan that puts out a lot of them, and then the rest of them are pretty much put out by university presses. This is Feltrinelli is another major Italian publisher. This guy, if you do read in Italian, Stefano Benai is astonishing, and this is a contemporary book by him that it's poetry, but it is like a modern street play. It's this urban tragedy with that involves a blind fortune teller and this teenage son and his father, and the teenager's out getting in trouble, and the father's trying to find him, and there's drug dealers on the street, and the mom's home worrying, and it ends in a tragedy. I won't give the end away. But it's all in poetry, but it's this just intense modern thing, and these are commonly read. Again, poetry is just very much part of the common culture, and when you meet at a cafe in Italy would have read this and is prepared to talk about stuff. But it's just very hot. It's like hot fiction. It's like having read a Danielle Steele or the latest Twilight novel. You've read the latest poetry book.
Novels in verse are very, very popular in adult fiction.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And I hope I find a publisher for mine one of these days. So I just have a couple of terza rimas. Terza rima is a chain rhyme where it's these sets of three, and it's like A, B, A, and then that middle line, the B becomes B, C, B, and then it comes C, B, C. So the rhyme keeps working its way down the page. And I have a couple of those. I'm just going to read one called Limoncello.
Did you bring some of that?
I did not. There's lemon soda there. Not limoncello. You'll have to come to one of the wine tasting readings. Limoncello. You have to watch out for limoncello. It sneaks up on you. Things begin to blur, and words will start to slur before you know what's happening. But don't let that deter you from enjoying an evening cocktail. You are on vacation. You might prefer something a little lighter, something pale if you were drinking in the afternoon. Slow down and look across the hills. Inhale. Add tonic water, ice, and lime. Perfume drifts in the heat, the scent of wild thyme, saffron and cyclamen and butcher's broom. Footsteps begin to fade, wisps of cloud signs start to appear like eddies on the deep sky. Quiet descends. Admire the design of the stone patio. Now raindrops seep like lovers' fingers into crevices longing to be quenched. You drift to sleep. And I think I will close it just because I wanted to remind you, I'm actually going to be on a panel on October 16th at 5 o'clock at the Sheldon Museum on, it's a panel of artists and writers talking about what the creative humanities can do in response to climate change. And actually, I'm there because my next book that's coming out in June is called Love at a Time of Climate Change. And it sort of is looking at how the uncertainty of climate change affects like everything in our lives, including our relationships. So I will close with this because Italy is wrestling with its energy future, but also part of the reason my daughter and her husband just left is in that northern area, the glaciers in the Italian Alps are melting faster than anywhere else on the planet. The permafrost is melting and the rock faces are falling down. There have been death after death of hikers and mountaineers, and my son-in-law is actually this huge mountain. He grew up there in northern Italy and just spent every weekend, you know, rock climbing, and you can't, it's too dangerous. You can't go in there anymore, and it's just, and there's no snow on the Alps. When we were there last year for 3 months, we were hiking in, you know, sneakers in January, way up in the Alps. It's no snow. It was like 50 degrees and gorgeous, and it's really got people concerned. So this is actually about Trentino, and in the Trentino Valley up towards Bolzano, we were talking about earlier, they have opted to put in these massive wind turbines, and they come down like right across the road. You drive like right under the blades as you're driving up there, and these things are enormous. They're like gigantor, and you know, much like here, there's like people love the fact that they're producing energy locally and are also really aghast at, you know, looking at them in the midst of these historic valleys and over top of these old castles and everything, so that you get very, they're very disconcerting. So this is a piece of Terzo Remo called Wind Turbines in Trentino. We have left the broad valley of the Po, along the Adige, its banks walled in, against the threat of floods on through Trento, past miles of industrialization, north towards Bolzano on A22, past hydropower dams and substations, hills rise steeply. Giants lurch into view, striding across bare ridge lines, invaders, an occupying army lumbering through the land, above grazing sheep and vineyards, propelled forward on immense spinning arms. Perhaps not invaders, sentinels, guards, a sacrifice against near future harms, a bulwark against melting permafrost, a sky harvest to bring power to farms that feed us all despite the rising costs, hard-pressed to grow more food in smaller space. With drought and climate change, so much is lost. Yet in the context of a strong sense of place, these turbines sit uneasily. No one likes to be reminded of the fast pace of progress and how we're under the gun to end disasters started long ago, chasing a future we cannot outrun. So I will leave that there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And there's lots of books. Oh, they want me to tell you about my tattoo. I've got a tattoo of Paradiso upside down. So during my graduation residency for BCFA has of course shut down in Vermont. They've sold to Cal Arts. In the last 2 years they've done their residency at Colorado College. So I did my final residency and graduated at Colorado College. And on the suggestion of, well, whenever I travel, I go to the libraries and say, what you got in special collections, just because I'm an antiquarian book nerd. And David's suggestion, who had a contact at the library there at Colorado College, I went over to Special Collections and said, so what you got? And they started telling me all about these Western authors, and I was like, okay. And they said, well, you look disappointed. What would you look for? And I'm like, well, if you had any like medieval Italian works, I'd be excited. And she says, just so happens we have quite a few of those. And it turns out, oddly enough, that they have this amazing collection of medieval Italian and Spanish works. And they have a bunch of copies of Dante's Commedia, and the earliest one that they have is a 1491 Venetian copy. They also have a rule there that many libraries are now adopting of no gloves. There's been this controversy as to whether gloves or no gloves are better for looking at antiquarian books. So I said, yeah, just bring me everything from like the 1400s and 1500s that you got. And so they rolled it all out in the cart. And I just sat there for a day and a half in my own little nerdy antiquarian book cabin, reading a 1491 Commedia. And one of the faculty, Betsy Scholl, who's also a Dante obsessive person, came over to touch the book as well. And we're sitting there reading through it, and about 2/3 of the way through the final book, Paradiso, the heading at the top of the page, the Paradiso was upside down. And a couple pages later, it was also upside down, and that's it, just twice in the entire book. Which doesn't make a lot of sense because the heading would have stayed on the letterpress when they changed the text over. And it also probably should have been upside down on 4 the way the pages are laid out. And all I can think of is that some printer's apprentice probably dropped the tray like in between tables and stuck it back in there and then realized it was upside down and changed it or something. And the archivist looked it up in the notes. There's this kind of set of librarial notes that follow books, and nobody had ever noted the upside down Paradiso before. So Betsy Scholl and I got noted as the researchers who discovered the upside down Paradiso in the 1491 Dante's Commedia. So I had never had, as I said, I'm 60, I had never had a tattoo in my life, and I'm like, I'm getting that inked. So I took a photo of it, and I actually did it directly from the
That's awesome.
photo of the upside down Paradiso. So that was my graduation present. Well, thank you so much.
What are the requirements for a sonnet again? It has to be 14 lines?
So it's 14 lines, and then there are all different versions, and it's sort of like, it's almost like there's a list of elements, and there's no right line. In fact, Shakespeare wrote, I think, 2 sonnets that were 15 lines, so it's usually 14 lines. Usually rhyming, and there's a whole bunch of different rhyme schemes that are acceptable. Usually there's something called a volta, which is sort of a turn, like it starts out with a premise and then turns. A lot of times it'll be talking about a general political issue, and then it ends by talking about something in a personal relationship, like, whatever, red states and blue states fight, and then it's like, just like you and I at home. Like, there's this, like, kind of a turn in it. And then depending on the style, as I said, the ones in Italian are based on a number of syllables per line. The ones in English are based on a number of beats per line. And, like, 14 lines, a kind of cohesive theme, a sense of movement, so that when it ends, there's been some kind of a turn or a change, and then usually some manner of rhyme scheme and some manner of metrical scheme. But it's one of those things where there are things like Diane Seuss won the Pulitzer. She put out this book, Frank Sonnets, and they're all 14 lines, and they have a cohesive theme, but they're not rhyming and they're not metrical, but somehow they sort of have the feel of like what's an opera versus an operetta, like what, it's kind of, it has the feel of, when is a play a comedy, or, like there's certain elements, and if it has those and it feels like a sonnet, then it would be a sonnet. But generally 14 lines, a rhyme scheme of some sort, of metrical scheme of some sort, and some sort of sense of movement and development in it.
You mentioned mentioned movement, and I have to go.
Yes, we all do.